Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm Suman, your host for today. Very often as policy analysts, we take to critiquing policies like we should, and it would appear that there is a lot of doom and gloom out there, right? Especially in the last few years with the pandemic, with so many other factors that are playing out in the economy, in the world at large. We see a disproportionate increase in these kind of negative news. Yes, it is all a part of life. Especially so when we talk about gender equity, in India. We're talking about falling labor force participation rates. We're talking about falling health and nutrition rates amongst women and children in India. So many other indices that talk about, how the pandemic has affected women more adversely than anybody else. But today, we are discussing something more positive, something that gives us all hope, and a topic that's very close to my heart, that of gender-equitable fertility preferences in India. Okay? In other words, declining son preference in India. Joining me to discuss this is my colleague Bharath, who, in addition to being a researcher and a program manager, is also a proud father to a 1-year-old baby girl. Welcome, Bharath.
Thank you, Suman. Yeah, she's not done anything much for me to be proud of, but
yeah, but just to have a baby girl in your hands is something, to be.
Yeah.
Joining us, we have a very, very special guest with us, the one who has made this discussion possible, the one through her paper has brought about much cheer and cause for optimism, Isha Bhatnagar. We will be discussing her paper titled A Girl and a Boy Are a Bundle of Joy, a Rise in Gender-Equitable Fertility Preferences in India. Welcome, Isha. Welcome to Takshashila. Welcome to All Things Policy, firstly. Yeah. And
thank you, Suman.
To begin with, can you tell us something about yourself? Can you give our listeners a short introduction of yourself? I mean, I prefer that you do it yourself because then I'll be giving a very condensed version. You will probably say something more interesting about yourself and, how you reached where you are right now.
Well, first, thank you, Suman, and thank you, Bharath, for having me here on All Things Policy. So I'm a sociologist and an international development researcher. Currently, I am a doctoral student in development sociology at Cornell University, New York. And so my research over this last decade, it looks at, I think about things like changing social norms around gender roles, expectations in the family. I also think about elderly well-being and reproductive and maternal and child health. And I'll share more with you about myself as we go through.
Mm-hmm. Welcome again. Getting started.
So Isha, before we start about what your study talks about, could you tell us a little bit about why this was a topic of interest for you? I mean, I understand that this is an important area for everyone to understand, but beyond that, what drives your interest personally in this area?
Sure, thank you. So I would say that there are two reasons. One is personal, and then one is related to my training. And in terms of personal, I would say that, so I've grown up in North India, and I often came across people, they would ask me, who's in your family, and I would say, there's me and my sister, and my parents, and then they'll keep looking at me wondering that I'll say I have a brother also, but I don't. So, and I didn't think about that too much. And I also had a lot of friends who would be like a couple of sisters and then one brother. Again, I didn't think too much, but I noticed these trends happening. And then I went on to study something called fertility preferences, which is like a subtopic in the area of population sciences. I did it I was working with a research organization, and then I started doctoral studies, and all of that started coming through. And there were three things that sort of moved me in terms of, I'm getting a little bit into the academic part, but there were three things I saw. One is I saw that across the world, people have something called fertility preferences. They have something like how many children would I like to have? Would I like a girl or a boy? These preferences actually exist across the world, in the US, in Sweden, in South Korea, India. So I was interested. And it doesn't just, sometimes it's linked to behavior, that if I have some preference, I may actually end up having that kind of, people can actually shape the kind of gender composition of children they have. It also tells you a lot about the society and the gender system. And like you brought out in the beginning, Suman, you talked about, the issue of gender equity. Is it happening or not? And I felt that what is happening in India will tell us what our gender system is also like. So that was one thing. Then the second thing was that we all know that, the sex ratio at birth in India has been worsening, which means that, since the 1980s, we've seen that there were a lot more boys. So basically what happens is biologically, there is a set number kind of boys that are born to like 100 girls. And it's a little more because boys have a lower survival rate. So just nature has made it like that. There could be a few exceptions, but what we saw that was happening in India and in other Asian and Eastern European countries is that now we have a lot more boys being born. It was above the biological norm, and it was, you could think about it as like a masculinized sex ratio at birth. So that was happening, and it has not happened in the history of the world, and this is just happening in these last 20, 30 years. So there was a lot of research interest in it, like why is it happening? And Amartya Sen talked about this concept of missing women, that there are girls who are just not being born or they're not being conceived. There's some human intervention happening here. So that became a big policy concern. And we know that India has taken a lot of steps in trying to fix that, but we still struggle with son preference.
Yeah,
and
I think
yeah, go ahead.
Even within India, you see wide divergence of this ratio, right? I mean, the southern states have more equitable ratios when compared to the northern states. So when we talk of India having an average of 108 boys to every 100 girls or 104 boys to every 100 girls, that again is skewed by some variations within the country. Am I right when I say that?
Yes, that is a very good point you've brought out. And that's kind of where I could talk about something which is called like implementing your son preference, that you have a preference and you try to ensure you have a son or a daughter. And the other thing is something where you just desire it. So sometimes I may prefer a son, but it's okay if I don't have one. So so we see that the desire is still higher than what's happening. So even like you're saying, in terms of the variations within the country, we have some recent data that suggests that even if there are regions which are much more equitable in terms of their sex ratio at birth, there still is a preference for a son. They still feel that you need to have a son. It's okay if we don't have one, but we still think at a normative level.
So you're saying that the desire is still there, but they're not stepping into crossing over into the implementation, as you subtly put it, right?
Yes, that is what the data shows, that the desired sex ratio at birth is higher than people actually doing it. And that's kind of where my research comes in. I was like, what are people just thinking about? Or what are the norms, Because there's still a pressure that even if so there could be two things. One could be that it's okay if I don't have a son, but, maybe I wish I did for specific reasons. And that's where I'll go into. And the other thing could be that it's okay, I don't have a son, but other people around me kind of, are still will question me. They'll say, oh, you don't have a son, who's going to take care of you in old age? Or, like, what about your property in the family? So those kind of things. So I feel like there's still that pressure still exists.
So just following up on that, so we understand that the skewed sex ratios are there, and there's a geographical variance within the country and all of that. But now moving on, can you tell us what were the findings of your study? What were you looking at, and what were you able to find through your research?
Sure. So what prompted me was I saw that there were certain countries that had a sex ratio that was normalizing and getting better. An example is South Korea. And it had very strong son preference and a very skewed sex ratio in the 1980s and 90s. And then it was able to fix it. So I was like, what's happening in India? Are we also moving toward that or not? So then what I did was I used data. It's publicly available data. It's called the Indian National Family Health Survey. I guess you all know. And there are 5 rounds of it that have been collected from 1992 to 2019. And they're just 2 very simple questions are asked to women and men. I use women's reports. They just ask, like, if you could go back in time and choose the number of children you'd like to have, how many children would you like? And of these, how many would you like to be girls and boys, or it doesn't really matter? So I just took that data and I analyzed how people's views were changing. And if it was changing among all subpopulations, was it changing among all class groups, educational groups, religious groups, by rural and urban? And that's so now coming to the findings, what I found was that there has been a dramatic rise in people preferring both a daughter and a son. So like what I call is like a balanced preference, at least an equal number or an equal proportion of a daughter and a son. And this has gone along with declining son preference. So you have less and less proportion of people saying they want more sons than daughters. So that was, we're moving towards equitable gender preferences. Then a couple of other things I found was that as long as people have a son, they're liking a daughter. It's kind of going side by side. I'd like to have a daughter and a son. But what about just having a daughter? That doesn't seem to have really increased or changed over the years. And more so, there's a very small percent of people, less than like 4%, across these like 27 years, who don't really prefer more daughters than sons or really have sort of a daughter preference. So that we see. So what we're seeing, I'm just repeating, is that people are preferring or appreciating daughters as long as they have a son, which is a big change also, but it's not enough to raise the value of daughters in themselves. Can I just stop having a child after just one daughter or not? So that is the thing. And the last thing I saw was that there's not much change in people being indifferent or gender indifferent. That is, there aren't, it's like less than 1% where people really say, oh, it doesn't really matter if I have a daughter or a son. So that is again another thing I found. So that means the gender of the child is very important. People still think about that. And you'll see that in all kinds of countries. There are very few countries where a large proportion of people would say that it really does not matter if I have a daughter or son. People still have some kind of gender preferences.
So how does this then pan out across, say, income groups, across education? I mean, does it have any correlation at all?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what I find is that we see a rise in the gender equitable preferences among almost all subpopulations. So more and more proportions of people prefer to have at least a daughter and a son, or just daughters across most groups, by, like I told you, by different class, by the birth cohort, like the time period they were born, among most educational groups, most regions, most religions. The only difference you do find is that there are certain smaller subpopulations in the country where you don't see a rise in gender equitable preferences, because gender equitable preferences generally is linked with wanting 2 children. So where people are wanting 1 child, that's where it gets a little tricky. Then they may have some kind of a strong preference, either a daughter or just a son. So it's not sort of equitable like that in that sense, but and you do see among some of those groups, you do see a rise in wanting daughters among these but you also see some of them having strong son preference too. Like I would love to have just 1 son, and that's fine with me. But you get it, it's a little tricky. You see a rise both in son preference and in daughter preference among 1-child families. But that proportion is quite low in general. in the data, we see that to be linked or associated with those people with risk, with living in the southern states, like you said, with Christianity, with secondary and higher education, with being where women's employment is higher. So we see this to be happening. This where there is, it's likely that it's because they're preferring a one child. So they're either showing daughter preference or they're still showing son preference, but not like, because gender equitable fertility preferences are linked with the two-child norm.
Yeah.
Yes,
If you decide to have only one, then your response to that question also will change, right?
Exactly. That's what I mean.
Yeah. While we're talking, your paper says that a lot of these factors are because of socioeconomic development or urbanization or income. As these increase, there is a change in fertility preferences. Okay, we are moving towards that.
Yes.
But at one point, you have also mentioned in the paper, or something that I read, that the sex ratio in India was most masculinized between 2005 and 2010, or that period, right? But that also coincided with the best economic growth that India has seen ever, right? So those were the golden years in terms of our economy itself. So what explains that, in the sense that when you have such high economic development, why were our sex ratios so masculinized?
Sure, that's a very good question. So this is coming from a different study. It's not exactly my study, but there's a lot more literature. This actually is a work that is explained by many theorists, but one of the papers I use is by Professor Ravinder Kaur, and she's with IIT Delhi. So and she's actually been explaining that what she's saying is that when people are moving out of poverty, they're kind of becoming a middle class family. And again, I'm quoting somebody else's work. I'm quoting her work. So just to be on the safe side, I'm just telling you. So when they move out from poverty into an emerging middle class, then what happens is the norms around gender have not changed. You still want to, and that's again, this goes back to the basic idea that fertility declines faster. People want to have less children over, every generation, the fertility is declining, but the norms around son preference do not change as fast. So for example, earlier I may have wanted 4 children and one of them would be a son. It would happen. The chances were higher. So I was fine. I only want 2 children. So I really, really want to make sure one of them is a son. So what is happening is that when you're developing, or like you're saying, when there's economic growth, there is a stronger desire to have lower fertility, but gender norms don't change as fast. This is across the globe. We see that. So
that takes longer.
That idea did not change. And along with economic development, there was increasing access to technology like sex-selective technology, contraceptive technology, which sort of helped people change shape the gender composition of their children. So there you can see that there are two things kind of playing. And that's an interesting part is that the theory also says that once people sort of move out from this, like from poverty to the emerging middle class, and they become the stable middle class, or they just progress with education and standard of living, then slowly gender norms also change. So you get it, it's kind of like a phase. That's the theoretical idea.
That the U curve or the hockey stick that we talk about.
Yes. So that's how it's explained by theorists, that it is, you don't see a change in gender norms as fast, but slowly they should be changing. And that's again a thing that I try to look at. Like, if gender equitable preferences have risen in the country, is it because of social norms? Is it because people's attitudes are actually changing? And I do find that is happening. We see it across groups. I use a mathematical formula, and I find that even if the population composition has changed, still all groups are changing in the way they think about the gender composition of their children. So they are becoming more equitable.
Okay, that's really insightful, and some cause for hope also, right?
Yes, you're right, yes.
Isha, just a question on what you mentioned a little earlier. So you mentioned that for the study that you've done, you've considered the responses of women participants in the survey. Was there a reason for this, and would you expect it to be different if you were to consider the male participants as well?
Oh, that's a good question. So one reason why I took women's responses is because this survey, they have 5 rounds of the National Family Health Survey, and they in the first 2 rounds only their respondents have only been women. So male respondents came in later. So that's kind of why I did not include it, because I wanted to see it across this long span of time.
Okay,
And
that
if we Yes, and if we look at male responses, I cannot give you a number offhand like that. But in general, we see that men tend to hold a little more conservative values.
Mhm.
So it could be that it would be a little. It may be they may show a little more sun preference than the women. But this is again very cursory that I'm telling you. This is just based on literature that kind of finds how attitudes are held toward gender.
Sure. Thanks, Isha. You have now we have now come to the most important part about social norms. But at this point, let's take a quick break and we'll come back and talk about it in detail. Welcome back, everyone. And we are discussing gender equitable fertility preferences in India. We have with us Isha, and she has been enlightening us about her research in this area. We are at this point at social norms. Something like gender is very much at the intersection of government, markets, and society. It's more of a societal factor. I mean, gender norms itself, but of course, markets and government can influence this in a certain way, right? When we talk about social norms, we are talking about, the seminal work, as we can call it, is Christina B. Carey's work on social norms, where we talk about empirical expectations versus normative expectations, right? Can you just fit your findings of this into that framework? It would give us like a larger view of the whole thing.
Thank you, Suman. I really like that you brought out that question. And, now there is so much of emphasis on studying social norms and understanding how do I measure them and how are they changing. And this is, again, the question that I'm thinking about. And you're right, it's really about the aggregate or the full society than just thinking about it at a very individual level. And the hard part is that it's very difficult to kind of isolate different factors that are leading to normative change. So it is really a mix of everything together, like socio-economic development. There are policies and laws. There's the women's movement that's changing the way people are thinking and engaging with the idea of gender equity. What does that even mean? Like the media is also having a lot on, you see so much on betiyan kuch karke dikhayenge. I mean, we see that in the last decade.
Yeah.
And
Although it may just be a lot of talk, a lot of rhetoric.
let's talk about that in the next bit.
Yeah.
And then things like urbanization, rise in standard of living. So theoretically, it's believed that all of these together change. And there are different kinds of theories that say it, like if people are educated, they're exposed to new ideas, they are much more critical of their own behavior, they have much more control over their life and fertility. They don't think like, oh, I just need a son now. They're like, it's okay, my daughters can also do something, they can be employed also, they can bring money maybe. They're not so dependent on traditional forms of agriculture, so they don't not so much dependent on sons for that. They may also have, because of rise in standard of living, they may have enough resources to equally divide healthcare and nutrition among daughters and sons. Elderly people may have pensions and healthcare, so they're not very strongly reliant on sons for old age care and support. So it's kind of a mix, and it happens together, changing people's attitudes, and that's really what it is. And you're also right about social norms and like normative expectations and empirical expectations, and that's another thing. You see that there are some studies in other South Asian countries like Nepal and Bangladesh. When it comes to people, the way people act is not just because I think I want to do this, or I think but it's really shaped by people who are around me or my reference group. So when I see that my neighbors are doing something, then I feel kind of pressured to do it. So these are sort of like expectations that I'm expected to also do the same. So those are kind of like social norms. It's kind of like what I see people around me do, and that kind of shapes the way I think I should be doing and I ought to be doing. So those are social norms. When I was talking about other studies in South Asia, in Bangladesh and Nepal, that say that people are changing the way they think. They're much more appreciative of daughters, but there is a social norm that I still cannot expect my daughter to offer old age support. I still need a son. So even if one family feels like it's okay, I don't have a son, they still feel the pressure from other people around them, people who and they cannot change that. They cannot ask their daughters for intergenerational support when they're elderly parents. They still feel like, oh, I still need a son. Though in my personal views, I don't need it, but because of society, I feel like I need it. It's kind of like that sort of tension, you could say.
So if you change what is the normative expectation, that is, if you bring about change in what society expects from you, if how society expects you to behave, then probably you will also see empirical behavior, right?
That's the theory. It seems like that's a lot of work is being done on that.
Okay.
They're trying to prove it and trying to see how it's working for everything, for other health behaviors. So it's
Yeah.
So Isha, on this point, so in your paper you talk about, so there are all of these things that are happening in parallel. So there's socioeconomic development, there's education outcomes are improving, health outcomes are improving, and a lot of people are moving from rural to urban areas, and social norms are also changing along with all of these other changes. So how is it that you measure the contribution of social norms?
How do you
isolate this when all of these changes are happening in parallel?
That's a good question. So what I do is I use this tool called demographic decomposition, and this is also used by previous researchers, where what we do is you see how the population has changed in its composition. So if you just have, for example, let's say a particular group of people, let's say people with some secondary education, are the group of people who are showing lower sun preference. So if tomorrow we just have more people in this group, it will appear at the India level that sun preference has declined, but it has not actually declined among all groups. It's only that the group that was showing it has increased in its size. So that's kind of how you do the isolation, like you're saying, that you kind of sort of isolate these changes, or these changes in the population composition. And then what you're left with shows you that change is happening across all groups. And that is what you attribute to normative change. Because you say that, okay, this change in the number of the percentage of sun preference has declined. I see this decline. This is not just because the composition of the population has changed. This is also because people's attitudes have actually changed across all different groups. Therefore, we see that decline in the percentage who are reporting a preference for sons. Does that sort of clear?
I think then when you marry that with that survey that you do about the questions, I think you will get a more comprehensive answer, right?
Yes.
So what do you think is, clearly you say that people who have been watching TV, there is certain correlation between TV viewing hours and their attitudes towards, gender equitable preferences. How does this play out?
So as a researcher, it's really hard to kind of pinpoint causal relations. For that, You need a very specific study. And there's, again, like so many factors that play in together. It's really hard to say if something has caused something or not. So we see an association that that if you're watching TV, you're frequently watching TV, you're more likely to report gender equitable preferences, but we cannot say that this is causing that. There is not a way to determine that, at least. And I also believe as a social scientist that there are just so many things that are happening together. Definitely, when people are watching TV, they're being exposed to new information. They're talking about something they watched. So there is some sort of an internalization of the ideas that are being portrayed on TV.
Yeah, I'm just a little skeptical about what they watch on TV because I don't know. I may be very, very, limited in because I don't watch much TV. But from what I know, what I see around, a lot of the programming on local television is terribly misogynist, terribly sexist, or things. So if somebody is exposed to that kind of information or that kind of thing, how do you think there's going to be a change in that? I mean, from what I at least hear and see, the little that I have seen, I think they just perpetuate the misogynistic views a little more than, otherwise would be. So I was a little taken aback, but I could be wrong on TV viewing because I have not viewed TV in years. So would you have like specific programming that actually helps with this, or is it just the free time that they have and therefore they are watching all of this?
So I understand your point of view. And I also see that it may not have like a direct causal relation. So I could be watching TV. It doesn't mean that I'm going to be very gender equitable. It's possible. And again, my study finds that there's some association. And a lot of what I try to emphasize on is that there's just a general normative change. There's just a general across groups, across, let's just say, at a very more aggregate level, there's just more acceptance of I'd like to have a daughter and a son just among more people than having more sons than daughters. So that's kind of what I see. It is hard to say how it could be linked to TV. I cannot make that statement either. What could be a plausible idea would be that there's definitely a long narrative in the country about having two children. So that's been there on TV. Yes. Exactly. And it looks like gender equitable preferences are associated with two children. Like I said, we don't know what would happen if a one-child norm comes in. It doesn't look like it's going to come in soon. It's a very small proportion of people who really prefer just one child. So again, it's hard to say. And that will really tell us about if actually there's still son preference or has the value of daughters risen in themselves or not. So,
okay.
Yeah. That's what
Having said that about TV, I read something really interesting on what happens on social media. Apparently, there are Instagram, I'm not on Instagram either, so I don't know, but there are Instagram reels that women put out. I thought that was fascinating because there are women who put out Instagram reels which talk about, why she should not be doing, so much work in the house and why the husband should take, all those gendered roles that we talk about. Those things that come on, apparently there are a lot of those reels that go around. And those have made a subtle difference to how people are viewing these roles. So it could be that, I'm just hoping it could be that even gender preferences will have some of these, we are we're looking at only TV, but I think at this point we have to look at all forms of media, social media, especially Instagram or TikTok or all of those, I think play some kind of role in determining people's or changing people's preferences towards that. I'll fish out that article and I will send it to you. Probably you would. It would be interesting. Bharath, you have anything?
I do like that you brought that out. I remember during the lockdown, during the pandemic, there was so much discussion on, the husbands helping out in the household. At least it generated conversation. And I think that, to me, social media can be a very powerful tool to just have people talking. And that's a big
although they went back to old roles immediately after the law.
Yes. And again, as researchers, one has to do a very kind of like a rigorous study to really find associations between this. And if it's really reflective, like you're saying, of just a small or like an event, or is it actually a long-term change? And there are all kinds of studies, even in the US, that say that some changes are just temporary when it comes to gender equity, and some are actually long-term. So I think we need more studies to find that out.
Yeah.
Finally, so in regarding the point you made about given how TV is and the kind of content that we see, could it really make a difference, right? So I don't know if this is true, but maybe there's a possibility that even the way it is, it's still more progressive than what reality is for a lot of people. So it might be moving the needle in some sense.
Yeah, just seeing women in all those different avatars could actually open windows out for a lot of people. Yeah. Finally, I just want to bring the role, because we do policy analysis, and what are policy interventions that could work? Either of you have any ideas to just bring these, move from gender balance to gender indifference? That is what we should be looking at, I think, gender indifference, right? So what could we do as policy? Is there something that we could do, or should we just leave it to society to evolve? What are some nudges, some small tweaks that, as policy, government can do?
So, no, I really like that point you brought out, Suman, that if you leave it to society, perhaps it will take a long time, and it will. I'm an optimist, so I believe it will change. But we really cannot wait all that long, and action is needed. And I do think that there are certain points. This is really an area that I have more papers on this, and I'm kind of thinking through these questions, like, what can we do? So it's not just the government policy. It could be civil society. It could be the media. It could be so many, so many things acting, so many actors together. So one thing, like I was saying, is that I like that you also brought out a move towards gender indifference. And honestly, there are very few societies where we see indifference, gender indifference, where it doesn't matter, or we see a larger proportion of people saying that. And even theoretically, people believe that that's how society would move, but it actually has not really been seen to happen. We see that even the most equitable, like gender equitable countries, like Scandinavian countries, there is still a preference for some gender of children, like at least a mixed. They generally have a mix. Some of them may have a daughter preference, but more of a mixed preference. So it doesn't seem like people become indifferent. So it's hard to even believe that that's going to happen. But what I would like to think about is, could we just have daughters being appreciated in themselves? So as the findings of my paper show, that daughters are being appreciated as long as people have a son. So daughters in themselves do not seem to be highly valued, or just, it's okay if I don't have a son. So then I go back to why is that? And I see that one reason is because sons are kind of like, there's a normative expectation that they are going to be offering old age care and support. And it's not really expected that daughters should be doing that, and it's even discouraged. And I've done a bit of field work.
The religious connotation about last rites, right? I think that plays, it plays on everybody's mind in terms of who will do my last rites. It's not the woman, it's not the daughter who does it. It's mostly the son who does it. So if I am religiously inclined, then I think that is one factor why I would want to have sons, right?
Yes, and you are right. There are these very recent studies have asked this question to people across all states in India, and you don't see much of a very strong difference between the North and the South. You see people in most regions do want to have a son for that reason, for old age care and for last rites. So that is something. So that's kind of where I'm now taking us. Is like, so what I see in like an example from South Korea, and South Korea also has very strong norms about elderly care and support, and sons being the one to do that. But it's changed over the years, and it is seen to be because gender norms have changed. But their work says that there's been a lot of just challenging this idea of the value that's attached to the sons. Like, why can we just not question that why do I really need a son? So that's where I think, and I'm also doing some follow-up research. I'm using this data set called the longitudinal aging study in India. And so now going back to the policy implications, is that this is again from studies across East Asia that we see where the elderly population has been are financially secure, they have housing, they have access to healthcare, then the son doesn't become very, very important anymore. It's nice to have a son, but it's not like everything in the world. So I think that is one policy thing to think about. Can we in India have some very basic access to healthcare, comfortable living for elderly people? And then that's one thing. Then we also see that I found this again when I was doing field work also, that when women are working, so they have some kind of financial autonomy. They either have control over some finances in their family, then they're also able to have more bargaining power in their family. It's also linked with the kind of relationship they have with their husband. So they're able to offer old age care and support. So if daughters are increasingly somehow able to offer old age care and support to their parents, it's possible that will also kind of reduce son preference or reduce this idea that you need a son for old age. So these are hypothetical situations. They are believed to be dismantling son preference in other contexts. So that could be another policy thing. Another last thing that I want to bring up about policy implications, it's a little bit tangential, but still I wanted to bring that up, was that when we think about why sons are important, we also see because they bring in a daughter-in-law. So just the son himself is also not everything for old age care support. The daughter-in-law plays a role, and a lot of the role that daughters-in-law are playing is like care work. So again, as life expectancy increases, we will be offering a lot more care to our elderly population. But care work still is very much disproportionately done by women. And this is across the world. And across the world, people have not been able to kind of change that idea and make that more equitable. So I would say that's another thing. How could we think about having much more equitable systems of offering care to elderly people? So the gender of the child doesn't really matter. Again, like what you were saying. So those are my points.
Yeah, thanks, Isha. Bharath, you have anything?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Isha said. So, but I guess bringing about the change in either religious things like performing last rites or cultural preferences might be a little harder, and it might take time. But making things like education or finance, making women financially independent, or even if the aging population is financially independent, that might make a very big difference in how gender preferences play out.
Yeah. We're at the end of what we had. If anyone has anything else to add, Isha, you have some thoughts, you could do it now.
Well, thank you. I really like how you both have been engaging with this idea, with the paper. And I really like your points. I like that you kind of distinguished between different, like the cultural factor that's harder to change and other factors like socioeconomic change that could be easier. But I really like that you're bringing out such big theories and social scientists are really working and thinking about these questions too. And let's hope. I'm glad that you also brought out that there is an optimism. That's how when you introduce the topic in the beginning. And that's really what I'm also thinking about. Let's just be optimistic and let's see. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Isha. Thanks, Bharath. Thanks for being on the show. And we'll meet again. Isha, we will be following your work very, very closely. And I really hope that, we can see more of your papers, more of your work, and we could have you again to talk to us about this. Thank you so much for being here. And we'll call it a day now. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Suman, and thank you, Bharath. It was really nice to meet you.
Thanks, Isha.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.